Today, we're tackling one of the biggest questions in history. How did the Allies actually win World War II? We're going to look past just the famous battles to really understand the core reasons, the strategy, the industry, the leadership that decided the outcome of the deadliest conflict humanity has ever seen. All right, let's get right into it.
Think about it. By 1942, Germany had its grip on most of Europe, and Japan had built this huge empire across the Asia-Pacific. If you were looking at a map back then, their victory looked almost certain. So how did this seemingly invincible force just crumble? What happened to shift the momentum so completely over to the Allies? That's the big question we're digging into.
You know, victory didn't happen overnight. It was really a series of critical moments, a few major battles that totally changed the direction of the war. These weren't just wins. They were absolute turning points that put the Axis powers on defense permanently.
All across the world, 3 battles in particular really stand out as these great reversals. In the Pacific, you have the epic naval clash at Midway. Over on the brutal Eastern Front, the Siege of Stalingrad. And then finally, in the West, the massive D-Day landings. Let's break down why each one of these was such a game-changer.
First up, Midway. Now, the key thing here isn't just about the ships. Japan's biggest strength was its naval air power, but at Midway, they lost 4 of their absolute best aircraft carriers. But here's the real kicker. They lost most of their veteran pilots. You can build new ships, but you can't replace that kind of experience. This single battle basically ended Japan's ability to expand any further in the Pacific.
Now let's jump over to Europe and the infamous Battle of Stalingrad. For Germany, this was way more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological disaster. It was all fueled by Hitler's personal obsession with capturing a city named after his rival, Stalin. He just kept pouring troops into this meat grinder of a battle, and their eventual surrender was a huge blow to German morale and an unbelievable drain on their manpower. After Stalingrad, the Eastern Front was a whole new war.
And that brings us to the final major turning point, D-Day. Germany's greatest fear, their absolute nightmare scenario, was fighting a war on 2 fronts at the same time. For years, they'd been able to focus everything on the Soviet Union in the East. But on June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. This invasion forced Germany to split its armies, squeezing them from both the West and the East.
But, these incredible victories on the battlefield, they don't just happen out of nowhere. They were only possible because of the overwhelming industrial and economic strength of the Allied powers. You could say the war wasn't just won by soldiers. It was won in the factories.
After Pearl Harbor, the United States mobilized its massive resources on a scale nobody had ever seen before. President Roosevelt had promised to make America the arsenal of democracy, and boy, did the country deliver. It was just churning out weapons, ships, planes, and food, not just for itself, but for Britain, the Soviet Union, and all the other allies. To give you a sense of the scare we're talking about, just look at this number, 90,000 tanks. And that's on top of hundreds of thousands of aircraft and thousands of ships. American factories were basically mobilized for one single purpose, to overwhelm the Axis with just a sheer volume of stuff.
And this chart really puts it all into perspective. By 1944, the U.S. alone was making nearly half of all the weapons in the entire world. That is more than double what Germany and Japan were producing combined. The Axis powers were basically fighting a war of attrition they had absolutely no chance of winning. But this was truly a global effort. The Soviet Union performed what was basically an industrial miracle, literally picking up its factories and moving them east away from the Germans, and they still managed to outproduce Germany in tanks by 1943. Britain brought crucial technology to the table, like radar, a total game-changer in the Battle of Britain, and they mobilized the immense resources of their empire, including over 2.5 million people from India alone. Okay, so we've talked about Allied strength. But that's only half the story, right? To get the full picture, we have to flip the coin and look at the critical mistakes and the built-in weaknesses of the Axis powers themselves, starting with Germany. What's pretty amazing is that so many of Germany's biggest wounds were self-inflicted, with a lot of the key blunders coming straight from Hitler himself. Declaring war on the United States right after Pearl Harbor? A colossal mistake that brought America's full industrial might crashing down on him in Europe. His personal obsession with Stalingrad, as we saw, wasted an entire army, and invading the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain created that exact 2-front war his generals were terrified of.
And it wasn't just poor battlefield decisions. German military planning had some serious blind spots. They poured money into these giant battleships that were just sitting ducks for air power, but they failed to build a single aircraft carrier.
Their bombers were too small for effective long-range bombing, so they could never really disrupt those Soviet factories. And crucially, they didn't invest in radar, which gave the British a massive, life-saving advantage in the skies.
Okay, so let's shift over to the Pacific because we see a really similar story with Japan. Just like Germany, they made a series of critical errors that came from their own internal squabbles and bad strategic math. In the end, their huge empire became their biggest weakness.
You know, one of Japan's biggest weaknesses was this intense rivalry between its army and its navy. They had completely different goals. The army was all about China, while the navy wanted to expand in the Pacific. This meant they almost never coordinated. They wouldn't share intelligence, and sometimes they wouldn't even help each other out. It's like they were fighting two separate wars instead of one unified one.
And the sheer size of Japan's empire just became its undoing. It was way too big to defend or supply effectively. Everything, food, fuel, soldiers, had to travel by sea, which made their supply lines incredibly easy targets for American submarines. On top of that, their brutal treatment of the people they conquered sparked massive resistance movements that tied down huge numbers of Japanese troops all across Asia.
And we have to circle all the way back to the very beginning, Pearl Harbor. On the surface, it looked like this stunning success, right? But it was actually a massive strategic failure. Sure, they sank some battleships, but the most important ships in the entire Pacific, the American aircraft carriers, were out at sea that day and got away without a scratch. That single failure meant the U.S. Navy could recover and fight back way faster than Japan ever thought possible.
So you put it all together. You've got this overwhelming Allied industrial power on one side, and these critical, fatal mistakes from the Axis on the other. And the final act of the war starts to feel, well, almost inevitable.
So here's a quick look at how that endgame played out. In Europe, Germany gets crushed between the Allies coming from the west after D-Day and the massive Soviet army pushing toward Berlin from the east. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the U.S. island-hopping strategy let them skip past heavily defended islands, isolating Japanese troops and getting close enough to start bombing Japan itself.
As the Allies closed in, they were facing this really grim possibility, a full-scale invasion of Japan, which they figured would cost millions of lives. But there was a secret alternative, something born out of this top-secret scientific effort called the Manhattan Project. They had developed a weapon with just unimaginable power.
In August of 1945, the U.S. dropped 2 of these atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was horrifying. You can hear it in the words of Japan's own Emperor Hirohito, who called it a new and cruel bomb, the power of which to damage is indeed incalculable. And it was that power that finally convinced his government that surrendering was the only option left.
And with that, the end came very quickly. Germany had already surrendered back in May. Then, following the 2 atomic bombs, Japan announced its surrender on August 14th, and just like that, the Second World War was officially over.
So as we wrap this up, it really leaves us with this final thought. The heroism and sacrifice on the battlefields were absolutely immense, and that can't be denied. But was that the only reason for the victory? Or, as we've kind of explored here, was the outcome really forged in factories, decided by smarter strategies, and sped up by the fatal flaws of the enemy? It's a complex picture. And the truth is, all of these things played a decisive role.